Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to get started in just a second. All right. My name is Maya, and I am BIG's program manager. I am very, very excited to be joined by Abby, Connor, Sim, Robert, and Matthew today. And I'm really looking forward to this amazing conversation. With that, I am passing on to Connor, who is going to co-host with me. Connor, go ahead and introduce yourself, and you can share the slides. Thank you all so much again for joining us.
Perfect. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon from wherever everybody is dialing in today. My name is Connor Joyce, and I'm a behavioral researcher at Microsoft. I'm also one of the co-founders of the Applied Behavioral Science Association. And welcome. Today is the first session of our Behavioral Science Job Call series. So we're really, really glad to have everybody here today. And I think we have a great panel to kick things off. So today's session is hiring a behavioral scientist, as a reminder, and it is brought to you by the Applied Behavioral Science Certification Subcommittee. And if you haven't heard of the Applied Behavioral Science Association, we are a community who is working together to build an inclusive behavioral science group where people can share resources, ideas, and work together to enhance the field. And we specifically, the certification committee, are working towards thinking about how to create some sort of future certification for applied behavioral scientists. But we want to use this call as a platform to begin to solicit ideas from the community about what is a behavioral scientist, and hence the name of the series. And today we're going to start with that discussion, thinking about what is it like hiring a behavioral scientist. Today's session is co-sponsored by the Harvard Kennedy School, specifically the Behavioral Insights Group, Ideas 42, and the Behavioral Science and Policy Association. We also have a survey, which will be another means of collecting feedback towards that certification effort, which is the Behavioral Science Jobs Survey. We will post a link to that survey in the chat, and we'd love for you to fill it out. As to reiterate, we're trying to be as inclusive as possible with this effort. And so for that means we want to hear from as many people as possible. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you for filling out that survey. I'm gonna let the panelists introduce themselves, but here is a quick overview. We have Robert Reynolds, Matthew Darling, Abigail Dalton, and then the moderator is Sim Sitkin. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sim, who will be kicking off our conversation today.
Thanks so much, Connor. It's really a pleasure to be here and to have such a wonderful panel to comment on the issues that we're going to be discussing today. And what I'd like to do in terms of framing this is we're going to start off with some basic background questions about the panelists. Then we'll move into some questions having to do with the role of applied behavioral scientists in their organizations and how one gets hired as a behavioral scientist. And we will open this up to questions at the end. But if you have any comments or questions as we move along, I would suggest that you put them in the chat, and we will try to bring them in as we're moving along or at the end. And I think, Maya, you're going to flag ones as we're moving along that seem particularly pertinent to whatever we're talking about at the time. So to start us off, what I'd like to do is to ask the three panelists to very briefly give us a little bit of context by describing the organization you're in and what your role in that organization is. So Abby, if you can kick it off, and then Robert, and then Matthew. Abby, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Sim. So I am Abby Dalton. My role is the operations officer for the World Bank's Mind, Behavior, and Development Unit, or MBED as we call ourselves. So I don't know how familiar everyone is with the World Bank, but it is a large international entity based in Washington, D.C., with offices and staff working all over the world with the goal of advancing equity and ending poverty. Within the World Bank, the Mind, Behavior, and Development Unit is the applied behavioral science team to the World Bank. So we are quite small. We're about 20 full-time people sitting in an organization of 16,000 globally. The team is fairly new in the last, I want to say, 5 years or so. My role within the team, so I am not an applied behavioral scientist. I am merely a fan who's been working in this field for a few years now. So I oversee project management, fundraising, communications. At any given point in time, we have about 50 projects where we are partnering with World Bank operations staff who are doing largely World Bank specific projects, whether that's lending, whether that's just implementation, to apply a behavioral science lens to the work of the organization as a whole. So this could be work on, disaster risk management and responsiveness in Haiti, on nutrition in Bangladesh and India, on aspirations and job search in Africa, you name it, we're involved in it. And so as part of that, I tend to oversee what our staffing needs are and get involved in navigating the hiring process within the context of the World Bank as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Abby. Robert?
Thanks for having me. Hi, I'm Robert Reynolds. I'm the founder and executive director of votetripling.org. I come here, I formerly worked a little bit with Abby when I was at the Kennedy School, and then with Matt when I was at Ideas 42. But as I mentioned today, I'm at votetripling.org. And so we are a nonprofit that designs and quickly mainstreams voter engagement innovations to help Democrats win. And so all of our organization's work is rooted in behavioral science. This last presidential election, our 30-person team's work focused singularly on friend-to-friend voter turnout programs because it's widely known that the best way to get people to vote is for them to be encouraged by their friends. So I'll tell you about one program we designed this last cycle, how quickly we mainstreamed it, and then what we're up to next. So our principal innovation this last cycle is a program called Polling Place Vote Tripling, where we discovered that if you stand outside of polling places on election day and ask people as they're exiting if they'll stop and remind their friends to vote, you can get an astonishing number of people to do so. And the reason is people are glowing right after they voted, and they're just so stoked. Civic engagement is the center of their identity for this one fleeting moment. And it's just very simple, and it works really, really well. And so this is a program we designed and RCT validated in the lead up to the election. But what we're most proud of is how quickly we mainstreamed it. The RCT came out in March of 2020, and the program was widely adopted by nearly 100 partner organizations by election day. And so that's an example of a program we created. We're now continuing to work on friend-to-friend voter turnout programs and are now starting to work on a broader array of programs as well. Last thing, our research team is led by a former vice president from Ideas 42, and we just hired a principal from the Behavioral Insights team and are really excited about the team we're building.
Great, thanks, Robert. Matthew.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me on. It's also great to hear from Abigail and Robert, who, as both mentioned, we've encountered before. I'm Matt Darling, I'm Vice President of Ideas 42. Ideas 42 is a nonprofit that uses behavioral science in a variety of projects trying to make the world a better place, working on poverty, working on domestic healthcare, working on international issues, trying to just basically go out there and improve millions of lives. I think, one of the things I'll add too is like I started at Ideas 42 10 years ago when we were sort of shoved into the basement of like 6 people at Harvard, and have seen it grow over the last decade to, I think we have about 140 employees right now. So a fairly large organization working, as I said earlier, in a lot of domains. I personally mostly work in our economic justice portfolio. So that's working on poverty issues within domestic United States context. I've done a lot of consulting work with the Department of Labor and also with the CDC. We do a lot of foundation supported work trying to figure out the the narratives of poverty and how we can change them. And a lot of work sort of in the classic nudge vein of saying, hey, here's a program, how can you make it slightly better or a lot better, hopefully, using behavioral science?
Great, thanks, Matthew. Actually, the three of you kind of edged into some of what I was going to ask next, which is about how you came to a focus on the behavioral scientist role. Whether, I mean, for example, Abby, you said you're not an applied behavioral scientist. To what extent, how did you really get into this, both in terms of the role, your experience? We're here on a panel on hiring behavioral scientists. How did you get into the hiring part of it? And how much experience do you have with that? And also, if you can comment a little bit on how projects differ when they require behavioral scientists versus when they don't require behavioral scientists. Now, I'm framing this as a very broad, multi-part kind of question because I don't think each of you need to answer each of those parts, but pick up from the things I just raised, again, to provide a little context for those who are with us today about how you're coming to the question we're addressing today of the role of behavioral scientists and how the hiring process works. So I started with Abby last time. Why don't I start with Matthew this time, and then we'll go to Robert, and then we'll go to Abby.
Sure, thanks. It's funny when you ask, how did you get into it? And I'll say, for me, on the sort of biographical level, like I was really into, behavioral science, behavioral economics, whatever you want to call it, as an undergrad in college, and graduated with like a self-designed major in that, and in 2005. And there were no jobs in it in 2005. It wasn't a thing that you can maybe get hired as a psychologist or an economist research assistant, but like, you had to kind of get it just right. I had a lot of psychologists say I was too much of an economist, and a lot of economists say I was too much of a psychologist. And so one thing is, I kind of retreated into consulting in grad school for a few years, and then Ideas 42 started to exist in the meantime. So I like to think that the field caught up to where I was. Ideas 42, and I don't know how different this is from the other panels say, but like, because we're an organization that specializes in behavioral scientists, we're probably a little bit different than some of the other folks that do hire behavioral scientists. Both because by definition, like basically everyone we hire at some level is going to be interested in behavioral science. Even if you're not on a project team, you chose to be here for some reason. If you are on our project teams, which 80 to 90% of our folks are, like you're going to be going out there and doing applied behavioral science work. That said, like I think there's that because we're so many of us are defaulted into that. There's obviously a mix of folks. So we have people who come in, with PhDs in social psychology and just a wealth of knowledge and information about that. And we also have people who come in and have, don't have too much in sort of like technical training, but like, they've read Nudge, they've read Thinking Fast and Slow, and they've developed a passion for it. And then I think the most people who join Ideas 42 are sort of in between that. Maybe you're someone who majors in psychology or economics. I think a lot of folks came in and have done some sort of behavioral project on their own. That could be, if you're a college student, a senior thesis, same thing if you're in grad school doing like a major project of that, but something where you go and say, hey, I'm really interested in this and I've actually found ways of applying it. And that doesn't need to be, within academia, like I said, but it could be, a lot of folks are saying, hey, here's something that, I solved this problem at my organization, and this is how I understood it. And this is how, thinking about human behavior in a consistent and methodic way, I was able to let me solve that problem. So I'll pause there and turn over to the other panelists.
Okay, great, thanks. Robert?
I guess there's a short answer and a long answer, but the short
Let's
answer.
go for the short one.
Yeah, the short answer is because behavioral science works. It's like that simple.
You can be a little longer.
My understanding is it is the most precise social science, and the problems that interest me in the world are things rooted around changing human behavior. And I observe in my own personal life how hard it is to like change behavior and designing programs that are informed by decades and decades and decades of research, it would just seem like malpractice to not do that. And so like my work in political campaigns are basically like an effort in mass human mobilization. And so I think it would be harder to say why we wouldn't do this rather than why we do it. That's my answer.
Okay, I want to come back maybe a little later about what was it that that it's not so much why did you do it, but what did you encounter obstacles for which this was the solution? Because I know, like for me, I was a public sector executive. And the reason I went back for a PhD to learn more was because I kept asking questions and I couldn't get answers that were actually either grounded or were useful. And I felt like I needed to go do some of that myself. So it was more because I hit stumbling blocks that I started becoming interested. It wasn't necessarily that people were giving me great solutions. It's just they weren't answering the questions I thought there should be answers to.
I suppose I had read about that and was familiar with these obstacles, but my first job was at Ideas 42. So I didn't have a career before that where I was hitting obstacles.
You didn't have to convince your colleagues. Right. Okay, thanks. Abby?
Sure. So I'll try to follow the assignment. So on my sort of personal entry points into behavioral science, I very much fell into this. As I said, I have no background in this, and I had briefly worked in publishing right when I graduated from college. And actually one of the books that I worked on at the time was the paperback edition of Nudge. So I was sort of peripherally aware of this field. I did a lot on personal finance topics just because of my own personal annoyance at the stereotype of English and history majors as being bad at money. So I knew about the behavioral science world around personal finance, but ended up being hired into what was then a new role at the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard, running the behavioral insights group, which Maya now runs, by Max Baserman, who was really looking for someone who could understand why behavioral science was valuable and could help organize at the time a small group of faculty to sort of make something out of this general interest in the student interest over time. And Robert was actually one of our first students who would constantly come to me and say, you know, you should really do this or that. And so he gets a lot of credit for how that evolved. And then I would say my niche is, I work with a lot of behavioral scientists who sometimes need help corralling their ideas in order to effectively run a program of many different projects. So at the bank, as I said, we have at any given point in time, 20 staff working on 50 different behavioral science projects. This requires knowing the ins and outs of the bank, how we work with operational teams, how we navigate bank funding. And so I'm doing a lot of that project management piece while also identifying what are our gaps. Do we need someone who's a behavioral scientist with a specialization in health and nutrition? Do we need people who speak French or Arabic in order to work in some of these countries? And so in terms of hiring, I would say behavioral science is relatively new to the bank. I'll say bank projects have been incorporating behavior change for much longer than our team has been around. And in 2015, there was a World Development Report, which is a flagship report on mind, society, and behavior, which really, canonized the idea that behavior change matters for effective development policy. And that's where MBED came out of. How do we operationalize the findings of the WDR? And so as interest in this has grown at the bank and demand has sort of outpaced our ability to address what everyone wants from us, I do a lot of that gap filling and figuring out what are the hiring needs. The World Bank is vast and has many different kinds of people. I was once in a meeting with a large animal veterinarian thinking about, antimicrobial resistance. It's a really interesting place to work, but it's also a lot of economists who think in very specific ways about how to implement their programs and policies and work with government counterparts. And sometimes what our team does, I'll say this is simple, but it's not, is talking to counterparts about how do you, register for this program? How do you get these benefits? Why would you or would you not, feed your kid X, Y, or Z? And often in the process of these diagnostic projects, the bank staff, who I think are coming from a more traditional background, say, oh, that never would have occurred to me from sitting in my office in DC or elsewhere. We thought we designed this really nice program, and now we can see some of the gaps. So what we look for when we're hiring are people who ultimately have some of that experience in navigating complex clients, who can deal with some flexibility around how the real policy world works, which is messy and complex, or can encounter if you have a pandemic happen and you can't ultimately sit in a room with semi-angry policymakers who don't fully understand why you're there. How do you navigate that and make sure that your work gets done? And so, as we're hiring, I think a lot of what we are looking for are people with that kind of hands-on experience and flexibility. And I think who can help within the context of the bank, even though this is becoming more and more popular, explain the value of what we're doing. So you may have a really enthusiastic, what we call a task team leader, which is the person in charge of the project, but maybe your counterpart doesn't really understand why this crazy person who is a social scientist is sitting in the room saying, let's think about how women sign up for these programs, or let's think about how teachers think about their students in different contexts and things like that.
So let me stay with you for a minute, Abby. In terms of defining the roles, you've started talking a little bit about that, but when you're creating a job description for a behavioral scientist, when you're trying to distinguish the behavioral science roles from other roles that people might be more familiar with in the organization, how do you conceptualize and communicate what's distinct about the behavioral scientist, the applied behavioral scientist role? And then what kind of knowledge or experience do you look for in applicants to match up with that?
Sure, I would say who we're distinguishing this for when we've designed our job descriptions are really for the applicants. So I think at this point, the bank staff and HR trust us. They know that we've designed this behavioral scientist profile. And what we're trying to do is make sure that 900 economists don't apply for a position at the World Bank because they see the job. So what we're very explicit about.
Can I interrupt for just a second, though?
Yeah.
I think it's also useful, though, to talk about how you describe it to others in the organ, because some people who are watching today might not be in the fortunate position to have already established that as a given in their organization. So it's both for the applicants, but also for others in the organization to legitimate it and help them understand.
Sure, and I think it's less about starting with legitimizing the role and instead starting with legitimizing the science. So I think I encountered this at Harvard. I've encountered this in other roles. Rather than say we need a behavioral scientist, I think what we've done at the bank and what lots of different organizations have done is demonstrate, here's how we're going to incorporate behavioral science into your project. So the first people with Embed were people who had been at the bank for some time working in other projects and could say to friends or project managers that they were working with, here's a project component that we think is valuable. Let's look at one of the earliest projects was on growth mindset in Peru, right? There's this interesting research on how students learn. It could potentially be a low-cost intervention. Why don't we build this into this bank operation? And that way, it's less about I need X number of dollars to hire a behavioral scientist, and more, this is something that I think has value. Let's see if it pans out. Like many of these early behavioral science projects, I think it was low cost, really high impact. And from there, it could sort of snowball over time. So by the time we were designing specifically a behavioral scientist profile, there were a number of behavioral science components and projects within bank operations that already had sort of proven their mettle and their value. And I'm certain that if we had started the other way and said we need a behavioral scientist, the bank HR and the leadership that we work with would have said, no, I don't really understand what this is or why we need it. And so in terms of designing it for the applicants, I think what we're looking for specifically is probably a little bit less flexible than maybe Ideas 42, in that we want people who have been working in policy for a long time, who have a master's degree or a PhD in something that has direct applicability to this work, because that's sort of a signal that's useful in the context of the bank. Again, not a behavioral science role specifically, a behavioral science degree specifically, but you have a PhD in psychology or economics, and you've done some work on this that demonstrates you understand how to measure this meaningfully over time. And the people who tend to be successful in these roles are people who have worked either with governments or organizations in applying even if it's not a field experiment, but done some of this work. So for instance, one of our recent hires in the last few years came from the European Commission's behavioral science team, which is doing less field work and more lab work, but still applying guidance to policymakers around how you think behaviorally about these policies and programs. And again, I think some of this flexibility and willingness to really get your hands dirty when we're not in a pandemic, people are going into the field, they're going to refugee camps, you're sitting in an office with, a dozen Kuwaiti, policymakers who may or may not understand why you're doing what you're doing, and being able to work with a real variety of people and sort of gather the information you need, figure out how to implement it in the context that you're working in. So never saying, oh, in this refugee camp, let's distribute 2,000 iPads. That's not going to happen. Let's figure out the actual entry points that we have. And go from there. So that's usually what we're looking for when we're hiring.
Yeah.
And I think
No, go
Go
on.
on.
Finish.
I was
Okay.
just going to say,
So-
and I think it's people who demonstrate that sort of flexibility and then ability to understand the complexities of the bank that do well.
So it's interesting you've added. So one thing I heard as a thread through all three of your comments earlier, which was interesting, is a key characteristic you're looking for is, in a sense, almost like street sense, street smarts of how to operate in an organization. And what you've added, Abby, which I think is also interesting, is to be cognizant, depending on the context you're in, of the need for signals or symbols of legitimacy, whether it's degrees or prior projects that you can show that they've made a demonstrable impact. What's interesting, and I want to make sure we keep all three of these threads, is none of you have really emphasized strongly substantive training or expertise in the science, in running experiments, or other kinds of research studies, although I know all three of you actually do care about that. So I want to make sure that as we go to Matthew and then Robert, that we keep these threads going, because I know people will be interested in that in terms of just prior on the ground experience, basic organizational street smarts, but then also substantive expertise in relevant issues of behavioral science. Matthew?
Sure, yeah, I've got a couple of responses to that. So I'll say, first of all, like I know for us at Ideas for Two, like the difference between the sort of behavioral science and the applied behavioral science is a real difference, right? And I think one of the things, and this is of course what ABS is trying to do, is like you don't necessarily have right now the ability to get trained in that or to credential that you've been trained in that, because you can go and say, hey, I've got a PhD, I've done all this research and stuff like that, and that's fantastic, and we can definitely use that. But at the same time, as Abby was mentioning, you spend a lot of time on day-to-day project management. You spend a lot of time being like, here's this new situation that I don't have subject matter expertise, and I need to build up so I can actually find where the sort of interesting behavioral stuff is. The other thing I'll mention here is, there's the classic sort of Pareto principle of, 20% of the stuff does 80% of the work. And I think that's very much true of, behavioral science as much as anything else. That, if I'm doing a project, a lot of times I can be like, okay, are people going to forget something? Are they going to procrastinate on something? Is there a descriptive social norms? And, if I ask myself those questions, which I think, you can get to with, not too much work, you get a lot of the way there. Now, that doesn't mean, some of my favorite projects, some of the things I feel I've had the most impact is when I'm actually digging pretty deep and finding, some random paper that Amos Tversky wrote in 1975 that actually ends up being the key to solving a particular problem.
Mhm.
That does definitely happen too, but it's something that you have, it's 20% of the projects, not 80% of the projects. So I think that's sort of part of it. But we do a lot of training on the sort of applied how to do behavioral science internally. And again, because we're big enough and we have people with a lot of that sort of on the ground experience, like we can do a lot of that training as you come in to Ideas for Two, which I think, if you're a smaller organization, or if you're an organization that's doing a lot of other things and also doing some behavioral science, not on the side, but as not as the sort of main thing you're doing, you can pick up on that. But the last thing I'll respond to Sim, you talk about like doing experiments and everything like that, and we do lots of experiments on that. The nice thing about doing experiments is to some extent like it's easier statistically than doing other types of hypothesis testing, right? It's very easy for me to teach someone how to do an RCT and run a t-test on a well-defined outcome variable, as opposed to something where like, okay, we're trying to test this really particular hypothesis. We have to control for all these things. We need to find some sort of quasi-exogenous shock out there in the literature, versus the RCT where you go and make it up yourself. Obviously, you need to know how to do power analyses. You need to do experiment design, and we have resources and we have people to train you on those things.
Great, thanks. Robert?
And is that, just to make sure I'm answering the right question, is it like what we are looking for in behavioral science roles?
We've covered a variety of questions as we've moved along, which we knew would happen about halfway into this session. That would be natural. So yeah, but the idea is let's say in your organization, when you're defining the roles, when you're looking for people to fill those roles, how are you conceptualizing what is the behavioral science role as opposed to other roles? What are the particular skills and background that someone would need to bring? I think we're moving into the hiring piece of it. And then I hope as we move through this piece that Maya will bring in, because there's some interesting questions and comments that have been raised that we can weave some of those in. It's really thinking about the roles and the qualifications and how your organization handles that.
Yeah, for our organization, and I mean, we're small. We have one behavioral scientist on staff right now. We will be growing our behavioral science team. Most of our team are like campaign trainers who train our partner organizations. But so I guess I can contrast what we do with what I saw at Ideas 42, where my sense at Ideas 42 was it was more like a generalist who had all skill sets. And so you needed to be like over time good at behavioral science and impact evaluation was my sense of it. For us, we've like broken these into two different roles. Like when we're looking for behavioral scientists, it won't be that important to us like what their skill set is with RCTs, because that will be led by a different person at our organization. For us, the single most important thing to me is someone who has like deep experience in diagnosing problems and understanding like what are the key barriers that are enabling this problem. So for instance, one thing we may choose to work on very deeply over the next couple of years is trying to like radically boost the number of people who vote at the very beginning of the early vote stage, rather than procrastinating until election day. And so for us to do that, we need to diagnose, why do people delay voting until election day? Is it because election day is more fun? Or is it because although you know who you're going to vote for president, you don't know who you're going to vote for like local school board until the very end, until your like newspaper endorses a group of people? Like for us to design a program that works, we need to know what is inhibiting people from voting early. And that, that's the single most important thing we will be looking for, people who have like frameworks and like numerous years of work experience diagnosing problems, because that informs what we eventually design.
Two follow-ups to that. One is to link it to something Matthew said of, the example you just raised of trying to diagnose how to ask the question right is different than running a simple t-test. There's a different set of skills, there's a different set of technique. Now, it's not just being smart and thoughtful. There is training associated with how do you gather and analyze that information to draw some conclusions. The other thing, though, I'd really like you to comment on, Robert, though, is that distinguishing the roles based on the stages of the process is something I think you were referring to. So, one person is figuring out how to formulate the question, another person is designing, let's say, an RCT, a third person is actually operating it, or maybe a fourth person is analyzing it and reporting it. Why did you decide to differentiate it that way? And what are sort of the qualifications you look for? Because some of the people who are asking questions and are watching may say, oh, I'm okay with running the statistical analysis, but I'm not so good at this other phase. Whereas others might really, to Abby's point before, I really understand the policy context. So I can help with the formulation of the right questions that will actually be used. Can you comment on why you chose to divide it the way you did and how that leads you to identify potential and screen potential candidates?
I can. I'll just say if I sit on this panel 5 years from now, I'll have a different answer for sure, because I have a lot more lived experience with whether or not this works. I just think they're different skill sets. Like the work of at least using the frameworks we use at Ideas 42 that Matt would know well, like the diagnosis work is very, very hard. And that can like dang near be like a full-time job, especially if you're working on like several projects. And then if you have diagnosed something clearly, like in this early voter turnout context, let's say it is, the core thing is people love the joy of voting on election day. Let's say that's what inhibits people. I think it's just a different skill set to design whatever intervention would solve that. And so we suspect that will be like, we'll have a role for diagnosing problems. We'll have a different role for designing the interventions and continuously prototyping and refining them. And then a different role for doing the impact evaluations. And maybe that'll work. Maybe it won't.
And what are you looking for in people for? So now actually, let me move to the question about the hiring, the questions about the hiring process, and use this as an example of, you know, when people are applying for such roles, what would be the kind of qualifications that would distinguish, you know, let's say you put a job posting up for 3 different roles or 4 different roles, and I'm a candidate and I have a little bit of A and a little bit of B and a lot of C. How am I deciding where, and yet another organization might merge those roles and say, we're just going to have one person and we want we want triple threat kinds of people. How do you do that? Let me hold on to that for a second, Robert. Let me go to Abby and then again to Matthew and then back to you, Robert, on this question.
Yeah, and I was going to jump in and say, we are the opposite. We expect you to do
Right.
all of these things and to do them well, and unfortunately to do them under enormous pressure and with many different complex counterparts. So I don't know if that's a sell or not for the bank, but when we're hiring, we want people who can do those complex diagnostics, which involves dealing with a lot of different kinds of, you know, beneficiaries and stakeholders, who can design the intervention, work on running it, and often we'll hire, you know, firms who can do the actual implementation, or bank teams or the government counterparts are doing it themselves, always with sort of our oversight, because as we all know, a lot can go wrong in the implementation, and then doing the evaluation component as well. So to that end, I mean, we have very high expectations for our staff, maybe unfairly high expectations, but the idea is that you will be involved in a project and you will see it sort of, you know, beginning to end, and then help think about how do we convey those results to lay audiences, whether that's policymakers or external audiences who are thinking about scaling up this work or doing this work in their own context.
Do you require that people, given that you're looking for sort of multifaceted individuals who can do they have to be able to do all those things when they walk through the door, or do you hire to particular strengths and then assume that if they're smart enough, they'll be able to figure out the other pieces?
So the core behavioral science staff on our team are required to be able to do all of those things when they walk in the door. And those are the kinds of roles we've been looking for now. I think if we were able to hire, you know, much larger, much greater number of people, we could be a little bit more forgiving, and you could be a research analyst who had a little bit of experience in this and was sort of learning over time. the other thing that we do, which is less relevant to people interested in working specifically in behavioral science, is other staff at the bank are interested in this work as well. And so often we're building capacity that way. So you may be working on a project where you have, for instance, a poverty economist who can help with the implementation design, but for the most part, we need you to really be able to run with a project in terms of who we've hired so far. For some of our projects, we're looking for very specific skill sets. And in those instances, we would hire on a consultant basis. So the World Bank hires a lot of short-term consultants. So we may need, a behavioral science and communications expert based in the Middle East who really understands the context there. And then we would hire someone specifically to that role. Or we may need, a nutrition expert who can help us with the design of a specific project. Because if you're a jack of all trade kind of person, you're not going to be able to know everything about everything. So we've definitely hired senior experts who can help us think through, issues around psychology and social cohesion, or folks who are experts in certain, fragile and conflict settings. So I think our team knows a lot and they do a lot, but they can recognize when they've hit their limit and we need to sort of, hire outside help or expertise or consult with folks to fill in those gaps.
Great. Thank you. Matthew, you want to comment on this?
Yeah. I mean, I'll say two things. One, I know Robert mentioned sort of like the different sort of components of like diagnosis and design and stuff like that. And I just wanted to for the audience who maybe not familiar with that terminology, like diagnosis is sort of like going and figuring out like, okay, what is the like behavioral stuff, whether you want to call it cognitive biases or behavioral bottlenecks, that is leading to, the undesired or desired behaviors, and the design is actually trying to ameliorate that. In terms of like sort of the spread, I think we're much more on the side of Abigail is, where the ideas for you to role is generically like we're mostly hiring people and saying, okay, we're looking for you to be able to do everything, right? We're looking to do behavioral science, project management, external partner relations, subject matter expertise. That said, I don't think anyone can actually do all of those things, right? And so everyone eventually develops sort of specializations. Where you're like, oh, I'm, really good at this. And so I will try to partner with people on my team who are really good at filling in the gaps that I have. The other thing is, as we've gotten bigger, we've had more capacity to do specialization roles. So I think, the biggest change in the last couple of years was actually like hiring a director of evaluations who just says, hey, I'm going to be looking at every RCT and making sure it's done, in this systematic way, making sure that it's done in a consistent way, and tracking these across every single project. So we're actually kind of getting a big picture look of our overall effect. And then similarly, like one of the big changes maybe the last 2 years has been doing a lot more sort of specialization within domains, right? So when I first started Ideas 42, I would just do, whatever projects came up, and I'd, be going and doing agriculture work in Mozambique, and then I'd be doing financial capability work in the United States, HIV work in South Africa. And these days, like I said earlier, like I'm mostly specializing within our domestic poverty work. And that doesn't mean that you never ever work on other projects outside of that domain, but it does mean that like, you do try to assemble expertise and networks and stuff like that within that group. That said, like I don't think we expect people to come in being able to do everything as they enter. I don't think I expect myself to be able to do everything after 10 years. But it is sort of, I know one way we talked about it at one point is like looking for sort of like egg-shaped people, right? You want to be well-rounded, you want to be able to do, most things okay, but you also want to have specific things that you're like, okay, I'm a real standout at this, and can really lend credibility or, be able to do stuff on my teams that other folks wouldn't be able to do.
Thanks. Robert?
I'm sorry to do what I did before, but I'm trying to listen to Abby and Matt and learn from them. And along the way, I'm forgetting what the question is.
So we were talking about, in a sense, how do you, well, you've actually already answered it, because they were almost saying, in contrast to what Robert said, we don't do it that way. And so I think that's useful for people to hear, because what we're hearing is there are sort of generalist approaches, and then there are specialist approaches. And, and you can specialize based on a policy area, let's say, or even a part of the world. You could specialize in terms of a stage of the process, in terms of diagnosis or research design or analysis, or, so there are different angles. What I'd like to do actually, and Robert, have you start us off here, is to switch a little bit to have each of you give advice. And two types of advice. One is advice to potential applicants, and another is advice to those who are kind of in your roles, who might be designing and operating operations with behavioral scientists in their organizations. And in particular, what I think would be useful, you don't have to stick to this, but a useful way of framing it is, what have you seen that you would particularly advise that people not do? So if I'm an applicant, what mistakes have people made that you could use as advice to someone, like they applied for the wrong job, or they approached the application process the wrong way, or in organizations, and by the way, we've all done this ourselves, so it could be your own organization, where we thought we were going to approach it this way, and it turned out that really wasn't the right way to think about this or sell it. And so I would advise someone else who's going to be in a similar role to avoid the landmines that I've stepped on in the past. So it's advice for the applicant and advice for the behavioral scientist, job designer almost. Okay, Robert, you want to start us off?
Yeah, it's really hard for the applicant. I would say we are most interested in the projects you've done. That's definitely far more of interest to us than someone's education background. Like, an education background is a huge bonus in this field, but like, if you have done behavioral science informed projects, either in your full-time job or in some way outside of that, highlighting what you've learned and what's gone wrong with those, and how you know to be on the lookout for those challenges you'll face if you were to join us, that's I think that's very powerful. Another thing, as like a very new organization, we were started in 2018 and didn't hire our second employee until late 2019. So we're new, and things change quickly. I would just encourage people to apply and emphasize like what you are, in what way you're like most fantastic, or you think you can add value to our team. Because there are numerous people on our team who have applied. They weren't the right fit for the role that they applied for, but we were very, very impressed by them. And then a new role popped up that we ended up hiring them for. So I would not be overly discouraged if you don't think you're a perfect fit for a role. I would just apply. If you're just, at least for our organization, if you're interested in the organization, because then you will be on our radar.
And by the way, there's an implicit piece of advice in what you said too, which is, if you haven't done this in the past, start dabbling, because in your current role, you can probably find ways you can start using some behavioral science, and that's going to be one of the key tickets. It's kind of analogous. Like, I know in our PhD program, of course you've got to have a strong background, but one of the key things we look for is, have you ever done research before? So you know what you're getting into, and that becomes a key criterion that's often used. Okay, we're starting to run short on time. So Matthew and then Abby, and I want to make sure we leave at least a few minutes, because there have been some great questions and comments posted that I want to make sure we get to. And one of them that I did note that might relate, and Matthew, you can talk about this too, is if someone hasn't had experience, are there intern opportunities where they could get some experience before they apply for a full-fledged job? Matthew?
Sure. So I'll answer the generic questions first. But yeah, I mean, go to your question about, how you maybe did stuff wrong in your job search. I one thing I think about sometimes is that, when I first applied for the job I have now at Ideas 42, you know, they had like a case study. We still do these case studies, but it's very different nowadays. But like, it was something where, you know, you were supposed to go and analyze some data and then write a short essay sort of explaining, you know, what you thought was happening and everything like that. And I sort of was like, aha, like this is a chance for me to show up all the cool econometrics tricks that I know, and wrote this like real long technical thing. And then sort of what I realized later on after I got actually hired and was doing it is like, no one actually wanted me to go and show off the technical skills. Like they wanted to see, you know, you write a concise paragraph that, you know, the person running the project could read. And, you know, if you want to put some technical stuff in the appendix. But like, and you know, that's a mistake that I made, but it's also something like I see made, you know, think a lot about when you're answering these sorts of questions, like what are they actually after? You know, they might not be wanting technical skills. They might want to be saying communication skills, and thinking about it like that. In terms of, you know, internships and stuff like that, we have a very directed intern program where we recruit through different programs. So we don't have like a general pool of applicants. And that's for sort of diversity and inclusions reasons, that we realized that like if we just hire people who had training in behavioral science, we'd get a lot of MIT and Princeton and Harvard folks, all of whom are great, but we also want to make sure we're getting a little bit broader than that. But we, you know, we do hire folks who don't have too much of a technical expertise. Like you can come in with a lot of passion, like Robert was saying earlier. If you've gone and done something, whether it's a project or for school or for your current employee, we can go and say like, hey, I really, you know, made use of behavioral science or behavioral economics in, you know, this and this way. That's really demonstrable. And the second thing is, you know, as someone who does a lot of the behavioral economics of labor markets, you know, it's really hard to find a good match. It's just really, really hard. And, you know, one of the things that has been really effective, you know, the behavioral science who have done this type of work is like, you know, you should be thinking about, you know, not just, you know, job, you know, going and doing a job interview as like, did I get the job or not? But like, okay, what can I learn about this? How can I use this as a way of practicing interview skills? You know, your classic sort of growth mindset intervention for people who are familiar with that. But like, just remember those sorts of things. And that's, you know, a way of getting yourself to persist in the job market. Because it is just hard. You know, we'll have positions open. We'll have, you know, way more applicants that we want to take in than we can actually afford to do. And, you know, it is such, you know, just a lottery in that case.
Okay, great. Thanks. Abby?
I'll be very brief. I will say there's very little I would advise folks not to do. We usually get such exceptional applications that I just feel guilty that we can't hire more people. So for the most part, we're getting really thoughtful people with lots of project experience. I think that's sort of the main thing that I would point to. I did have two experiences. One was an undergraduate student once called me unprompted on my phone on a Sunday to talk about internship opportunities. I'd never heard from them before, went straight to voicemail, and I did not get back to them because that seemed egregious to me. I'm sure they meant well. And then someone once showed up in my office, said, do you have a minute to talk? And I said, no. And they came in and closed the door to talk to me. So I would advise you not to do that, but I'm sure no one on this call would do that. And then in terms of internship opportunities, so we do have an internship program every summer. I usually list for it in January or I guess December or so. We hire about 6 folks each year, mostly master students from policy programs, but also occasionally PhD students or undergrads who really get treated as members of the team. So they get thrown into projects, you know, supporting various different stages of this. I always say you're never going to get a full World Bank project in a summer, but I try to get you access to, you know, something that's in the diagnostic phase, something that might have an evaluation coming up. And so if you go to our website, which is just worldbank.org/embed and sign up for the mailing list, then that's advertised, I think, fairly well. And if you're at an institution like, I know I tell Maya when we're hiring interns, and that goes out through HKS and other places as well.
Okay, then I want super quick answer from each of you on this last question, and then I'm going to ask Maya if we can get some more in. Are you hiring right now? And if so, what should people do to get into the queue and to apply? Abby, do you want to start us off?
Sure. We are not hiring right now, but it's looking hopeful that we will be hiring at some point this calendar year. Again, I would sign up for our mailing list if you haven't already, because we'll absolutely be advertising that way. And again, these are going to be positions that are It requires like project experience backgrounds, some combination of research experience, working in policy, something like that. So when in doubt, apply. I would never encourage anyone not to apply, but that's generally what we're looking for. So keep an eye out for sure.
Okay, great. Thanks. Robert?
Yes, we are. So I just chatted. Did this go through to the panelists?
Yes, it did.
Cool. If you fill out that form, you will get sent all of our future hiring announcements. So I encourage you to do that. Even if you're not interested in our work, you'll see the way we write job descriptions, and maybe that'll be a bit of a North Star for skills to go get these same type of roles elsewhere. And the link I just posted is actually where the job descriptions go up. So there's just one role open right now. It's less of a behavioral sciencey role, but it may be of interest to some people.
Great, thanks. Matthew?
Yeah, we're hiring. I think we've got, I can't remember the exact number, but something around 6 to 10. We're anticipating hiring people over the summer. And most of that's our senior associate role, which is sort of for people not entry level, maybe 5 to 6 years of experience, maybe a master's degree, but there's some sort of project management experience. And that's sort of the generic role that we were talking about earlier. We're also hiring in some of the specialist roles. So for example, we know that our domestic health and our charitable giving sides are growing, are growing a lot in the next couple months. And so we have some specific roles there where if you said, okay, I really am, passionate about charitable giving or domestic health, like, or have a background in those, like those are ones to specialize in. And like Robert, I dropped a link in the chat.
Okay, great. Thanks. Maya, are there any questions or comments that bubble to the top before we wrap up?
Yes. First of all, I just want to tell everyone we will continue this conversation. We received so many wonderful questions, and so please join us again. And we will also send you the survey where you can actually add these questions. So the conversation is just starting. But one thing that I wanted to ask is a question from Melissa. So what's the best training program for employed enthusiasts? Someone who does not have time to complete a university program and such, that wants to become a practitioner and eventually become a behavioral scientist. I'm trying to formalize behavioral science as a lens tool in my organization, but I need to get some projects under my belt to become credible and influential. And I think there's probably a significant number of people in the audience who are looking to sort of develop skills and move into the field. Any sort of answers to that would be helpful.
Who wants to hop in?
I kind of want to hear Connor answer that. I know he's not a panelist, but I know he's probably thought about that the most.
Connor, you want to hop in?
Yes, the question was, for a working professional, what are the best training programs that aren't full educational programs, right?
Right, yeah.
I think, it's something that we've talked about a lot. And it's something that I think we've heard a good amount from. I believe that what comes to mind is first, there's obviously a lot of great books. And I think that books are an initial great source for it. There are good Coursera courses and like massive online open courses that you can kind of do at your own pace. I myself have found those very useful and it kind of will point you towards some specific reading too from a variety of books. But honestly, yeah, I'd have to put more thought to say what the best are beyond that. But it is something that I know APSA is working on is aggregating that.
Okay, Robert, you want to hop in? Oh, wait.
I'll
Robert
mention
just
Ideas
said
42
here.
does have an academy and I linked that.
Yes, right. There is a program there. Robert, you were going to do a quick one, and then I think we're out of time.
So I thought a lot about this back in the day when I was just starting, and I think my answer is just doing little experiments in your own day-to-day life. And so I'll share in the link right now 2 articles I wrote in 2016 before I got to Ideas 42 around little lessons I was learning from experiments, where I thought just little experiments you ran in your own day-to-day life trying to nudge people that you interacted with, I thought that was a lot higher ROI for my learning than like reading behavioral science studies or like reading the 15th behavioral science book. So I'll share these articles. I don't know if I agree with my opinions in them anymore, but I at least agreed with them enough back in the day to post them. But those are insights I had around starting to learn how to do behavioral science.
So let me, in just wrapping up my component of this is first of all to thank Abby, Robert, and Matthew, the three of you, for providing such wonderful information for people, and for joining us, and Connor and Maya for hosting this for us. And let me just make one quick observation, that there are a number of organizations now. ABSA is one, Behavioral Science and Policy Association is another, but there are a number of them around the world. And Matthew just mentioned that Ideas 42 is offering training. There are others that are looking at credentialing and what are appropriate requirements for hanging a shingle up and saying I'm in this role or that role and I'm qualified. So as Robert said, if we come back in 5 years, he'll have different answers to the questions based on his experience. I think the answer to the general question of what qualifications do you need and what are the expectations is going to evolve over time, including what is it that gives you the credentials, not just degrees, but what experience, what knowledge, what skill sets do you need to have? So you could have had a lot of experience, but when someone's interviewing you and they say, well, do you know how to do this? Do you know how to do that? And your answer is, no, I don't know how to. Well, the experience may not be as relevant to the job as you thought it was. Similarly, if you don't have the substantive knowledge of what the behavioral science that's already been done says, you're at a disadvantage. But all of those things you can get through a variety of mechanisms, but expect that this is a relatively new and a rapidly evolving area. And 6 months, 12 months, 2 years from now, it's going to look quite different. But I think we've gotten some tremendous insights from the panelists today on where we are as of today. So I want to thank all of you who have attended, and for the panelists for joining us. And let me turn it over back to Maya and Connor.
Thank you so much, Sim, and thank you for the panel and to all participants today. So the recording will be available on our Twitter page, and handle is Harvard BIG. And with that, we will see you again. I think, Honor, is it August when we have our next call?
August 6th is our next call, and we'll be sending out more details.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.